Welcome everybody to the Charles Evans Inniss Memorial Library of the Medgar College, to the conference on the Women in Abolitionist movement. The conference is part of our program here in the library dedicated to the Women's History Month. And the first talk will be by Dr. Maria de Longoria. I'd like to welcome her here. She will tell us about her research. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be very brief. I am not a formal presenter at the conference. I have a conflict. So in planning the conference, Raul and Lexi had indicated that they thought my research was important and would add to the program. So they asked if I would just say a few words about it before the conference really gets kicked off. So we're going to be really, really informal. And if you have any questions, you can stop me. And I'm going to be brief. Okay? And then you will come back, and then you will have your formal conference program presentation. So the conference that the organizers have planned today looks to be something that's exceptional. And again, I'm sorry that I won't be able to continue and stay longer, but I look forward to seeing the recorded program. Hint, they said recorded, so if you didn't know, it is recorded. Today you'll be looking at women in relationship to the abolitionist movement and also at Ida B. Wells Barnett. My work, while it specifically does not focus on the abolitionist movement, it looks more at the reason for the movement as directly impacted by enslaved and free black women with their intersection of race and gender that mainstream society, both then and now, saw as variables that made them the least relevant and the least significant, at least in theory. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his book Between the World and Me, wrote, quote, "In America, it is traditional to destroy the black body. It is heritage. It's in this tradition, this heritage, that is particularly exhibited on black women's bodies. Let me explain a little more. Black women, both enslaved and free, during slavery and since, saw and experienced the use of their bodies as symbols of honor and violence. This occurred during slavery, before enslavement, if we go back and look at the experience of capture and transport in the Middle Passage, etc. During the Reconstruction period, during the post-Reconstruction period, where there was an increased violence against black women, especially in what became the New South, and it's continued in the 20th and 21st centuries. We see it in the treatment of black women, in the priority that black women do and don't have in society, in the stereotypes and depictions, both old and new, of black women. It is seen in the lynching of black women. Whatever their alleged infractions / crimes, there's always been some sort of sexual aspect, either to or for the lynchings itself, at least in the ones that I've looked at. So historically, there's been a role that violence has played in maintaining the power structure in America. You see it especially in the South, but it's widespread. The concepts of honor and violence permeated almost every aspect of Southern life. Honor and violence, and particularly relevant to the dynamics between black women and white men. The black woman's body represented the ultimate identification of white manhood. Honor, which is often exhibited or controlled, through violence directed at that black female body. So I want to kind of divert now from what I had written out and kind of just talk a little bit more about this whole aspect of honor and violence and kind of bring it briefly forward to the lynching. So when you look at when you look at white men and black women's dynamics, if you start with whether it was white men, young boys or young white men who were experimenting with sex during slavery, whether it is the overseers and the masters who used slave women for enjoyment or for breeding, or whether it was mistresses who were feeling unable to hold their husbands and their sons and their fathers and their brothers accountable for their actions and their treatment of black women, you kind of see black women's bodies taking the brunt of this whole dynamic and the interaction and the interplay between the two. And this whole concept of Southern honor. When I mentioned briefly this idealized idea of white male honor, in the South in particular, this white manhood was defined by white men's ability to protect their families, to provide for their families, to be what they considered in the South a proper gentleman. Part of that proper gentlemanness included being sexually experienced when they got married, but yet white women were not supposed to be sexually experienced. So then where do these young men get their practice? On slave women, on black women's bodies. So that's just an example of how this idea of honor kind of is intertwined so closely with this whole concept of violence and of black women's bodies. You also see, as we move forward from slavery during the Reconstruction period, you see that there is this whole concept of black women being able to control their bodies, well, this thought of. And one of the ways that you see things played out, not just in the South at this point, but you'll see it in the North. Prior to this, when black men did not really have the ability to protect their families the way they wanted to, because there are some ways in which there are protections, but not the way they wanted to. You see that during Reconstruction, there is this movement for black women to kind of adopt what society has deemed to be the ideals of womanhood. And you see it in the dress, you see it in the behaviors, you see it in the aspect that black men wanted their women to kind of stay at home, where it was easier for them to protect them from white influence, from white control, from white violence. And during the post-Reconstruction period, where you see an increase in violence against black women, and that was used as a way to kind of prove to these free people that the South was re-emerging, that it was taking control again. So when you had slavery in existence, you had a sort of, I don't want to use respect, but it wasn't in one aspect, where the only people who could abuse your own slaves or free people in your neighborhood were you, because they were your property. You didn't go and abuse necessarily somebody else's property. So there was that kind of pseudo-protection. After the war, after the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery, you didn't have that, and there was this mindset that now we have to prove to these people that they are not free, that they are not equal, that they are not protected. You don't have the protection of anybody's owners at this point, and you saw an increased violence, especially going into the post-Reconstruction period. Again, this whole thing of concept of honor and what it meant to protect the South and protect this ideology and protect this mindset. And again, it's exhibited, it's being used and displayed on black women's bodies. And if we then come even further to look at lynching, one of the things with lynching is that there is this, and this is for male and female, this concept that it was a protection of Southern white womanhood, right? And white womanhood in general, because lynching also take place in the North. And that it was because black men were raping and attacking all these white women, and that's why these black men were being protected. Even though statistically, right, even by the statistics used by folks who kept lynching records and through newspaper articles, the #1 alleged crime was not rape, it was not attack of white women, it was not the protection of white women, it was more murder. That was the #1 allegation. Now, in the research that I've done, in looking at the lynching of black women, even though some of the charges are murder, there is this sexualized component of the lynching of black women that has been present in every case that I've looked at so far. So it might have been that there was a relationship, and I use that term loosely, prior to the lynching. So there could have been rape, there could have been forced cohabitation, it could have been consensual. But even if it was consensual, there is consent and then there's consent. One of the cases that I did look at, there was consent. There was a young girl involved with, for lack of a better term, I guess it was her boyfriend. But when you go back to this whole concept of honor, these kind of relationships were not honorful if there was evidence of it, and she was pregnant, so there was evidence of it. So there's a sexual aspect there. And if you keep digging and looking, you'll see that, again, if there's no actual sexual relationship that can be attached to the lynching victim, then there is some kind of sexual element attached to the lynching itself. Whereas black women are often stripped and held naked and ridiculed or gang raped or body parts, which this is similar to black men, mutilated in the process. But there was this whole dehumanization of womanhood was associated with these lynchings of black women. And so in that vein, when we look at the abolitionist movement and women's participation, and in particularly Ida B. Wells, you know, one of the things that she did was she worked so tirelessly for the abolition of, she worked so tirelessly for the anti-lynching crusade, but she recognized that there was a certain, what's the word I want to use, a certain, oh geez, I'm drawing a blank. So I'll rephrase that and maybe I'll come up with another word. There was a certain, that's not rephrasing it, no, is it? There was there were elements of society that there were characteristics, there were elements of lynchings that for black women made this kind of dynamic, this existence in the society so drastically different. And that's evident through her work with the National Council of Colored Women and working on women's rights, because she kind of shifted her focus while she still stayed, you know, connected with the larger race-based organizations and race work. She also moved so heavily towards gender work. And I guess I'll just kind of stop there if you guys have any questions, only because I'm sorry that I'm on a time crunch. So do you all have any questions? Yes.
I love that you talked about Ida B. Wells.
Well, she's on your schedule, so I think someone else is talking about her.
Me.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, actually, next year, we'll do this again. Because this is just so appropriate for Women's History Month. But instead of Women in the Abolitionist Movement, I think the name should evolve into Women and the Abolitionist Tradition. And you speaking on Ida and the continuity of her place in this continuity of empowered women, changing history's narrative of oppression, just very harmonious with that theme.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're trying to get a street named after her in Brooklyn.
No, I didn't.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, she lived here in Brooklyn
Yes, that I knew.
3 years on Gold Street. And that was a very critically important time in her life.
Did you find any difference in the lynchings in the North and South? Any variables?
When it comes to women, not particularly. I looked specifically, part of my dissertation, I chased and investigated 2 lynchings. One was in the South, one was in the West. But in determining which 2 to do, I kind of looked at deeply some that took place in other regions. And what differed might have been some of the record afterwards. There really wasn't that much difference. And again, most of the ones I looked at took place in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. They all had this kind of sexualized. So the one in South Carolina, the woman was the nanny of the family. She was accused of killing the little girl who worked in the family. As it turned out, the husband was having a relationship with the nanny, and it turned out that she did not actually kill the little girl, but yet that was what had to be kept quiet in this whole with this whole idea of honor, right? Because you're supposed to do that, but it was supposed to stay quiet. It wasn't supposed to be public. And the one that I looked at that took place in Oklahoma, that was the young girl who was pregnant by the young man. And even in the recording, in the document, the newspaper covers afterwards, they created husbands, they created families, so that these 2 people, these characters, were honorable, and because they had these wives, and though one of them didn't, right, and had these families, that nobody would dare think that this could have happened. I think I'm done.
Well, I mean, we could continue, definitely, but otherwise, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Longoria, for her very enriching, educating presentation.
Impromptu?
Absolutely. And Dr. De Longoria is Medgar Evers faculty, and I'm proud to be a colleague of hers.
So sweet. Thank you.
And now I would like to invite another distinguished Medgar Evers faculty who doesn't need an introduction, Dr. Brenda Green. I'm giving floor to her. She just had her own conference yesterday for Black Writers Conference that she conducts for many years. Dr. Green, welcome.
So thank you, Alexi, and thank you for inviting me to just give a few remarks. I also am not on the program, but I did want to welcome you on behalf of my work as the director of the Center for Black Literature at Medgar Evers College, and also chair of the English department. This is such an important program, and these are the kinds of programs that we should be continuing to have in the library. The library is an extension of the larger community. So I really, really applaud you and thank you for having this program. The Center for Black Literature is one of the major centers at the college. It was founded on the principles, the model of the Gwendolyn Brooks Center in Chicago State for Gwendolyn Brooks Center for Creative Writing and Literature. And our mission is really to support the work of Black writers and to ensure that the general public knows about the work of Black writers. And we do this through literary programs, through conferences, through symposia, readings, workshops, and we have a large educational program with our youth in the schools. We work with high schools and we bring teaching artists into the schools. And part of why we do this is because we do not have in the schools enough information about the work, the writing, and the literature of writers. So this becomes, a program such as this can become the foundation or lay the foundation for how we can disseminate this to the schools. One of the earliest writers who was part of, if you think about Black writers being part of the abolitionist movement, was Phyllis Wheatley, of course, when she wrote on being brought to America from Africa. She was really one of our early abolitionists because in that poem, which has been examined on many levels, it was really a critique of the situation of being enslaved in America and what that meant. It was a way of really looking at how can you have a country that's founded on the principles of Christianity and yet continue to enslave people. So we can look at the abolitionists by looking at the literature they created. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and Harriet Jacobs is a very important work. It's another way of getting students and young people to look at the history of abolition, at the abolitionist movement in this country. Clotel, or the President's Daughter, is another way of looking at how we can examine the abolitionist period. So you can look at it from the perspective of sociological texts and essays, but literature, I think, becomes a really good way of ensuring that people understand what is happening, and you get the interior lives of the people who were part of that movement. So I want to, again, commend you for doing this. I encourage us to look at this from many perspectives. If we're going to do this again, let's look at the literary perspectives. And I also, if you're in the schools, we need to get this in our schools. There are some people who have done books that focus on the history of abolitionists, but from a perspective of something that can be read by young people. One of the writers who was at our conference yesterday, he's a poet, his name is Quraish Ali Lansanar, and he wrote a book of poems on Harriet Tubman called They Shall Run. It's a wonderful way to introduce young people to what was happening in that movement. So again, thank you, and I wish you success on an important program and a conversation that really needs to be continued and expanded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure and honor to have you to address our conference. And we hope that this conference is a start of a very good tradition that will continue in the future. And this conference should become an important forum of disseminating information about the women, about the slavery, about the resistance to the slavery in all of the United States and all of the world, and especially in the context of Brooklyn and our local community here. I'm looking at the poster, at the portraits of these distinguished women, and Dr. Green mentioned Harriet Tubman. When reading her biography, you see how, while being a little girl, the person already suffered in the world of slavery. She was beaten by the slave owner, and at some point he threw a rock at her, at another person, missed another person, and Harriet Tubman had a significant trauma on her head and suffered from it for the rest of her life. And reading similar accounts, you see that the little girls, well, and also boys, were taken from their parents, moved to different locations, suffered a great deal with that kind of life, with the slave labor. And then eventually many of them were killed through the lynching, as Dr. De Longoria today also gave us account in her talk. Violence against African American women, sexual violence. Some research, I remember, showed the legal side of that kind of violence, and I was amazed to learn that if an African American woman was raped, it actually wasn't a rape, it was trespass to chattels. How it could exist in almost contemporary world, in almost contemporary society. But this is a great lesson for us, that our ancestors, they were able to some degree to overcome this kind of outrageous phenomenon in the society, and we have to remember about that. And our goal to disseminate this information as much as possible, and our conference hopefully will serve this purpose. I'm giving floor to